Hello, welcome everybody. I know there are quite a few others going to join us. If I could all ask you to mute before we start, that would be useful just for the feedback or any background noise. I think I can mute people as well. So thank you very much for joining us. This is our session on future-proofing the workforce. Just to introduce ourselves very quickly, my name is Owen John. With me is Damien Phillips. Good morning, Damien.
Morning everybody. Morning, Owen.
We're both partners and employment lawyers at Darwin Gray, and we're running this session through WCDA. And as I say, thank you very much for joining us. We're intending for the session to, well, the entire slot is for about an hour, but we anticipate that we'll probably run to about 45 minutes with plenty of time for any questions at the end. If you want to raise questions through the chat facility, we'll come to those at the end. That's probably better than affecting the flow of the slides otherwise. You will get copies of the slides, and you also get a copy of the recording of this. So it would be remiss of me not to mention that we are recording the session, and if anybody has got an issue with that, then please let us know. But you will be getting a copy of the recording and the slides through following the session. Those will probably come over the next couple of days. In terms of what we'll cover today, both of us, myself and Damien, will be running the session and we'll be pitching in at different times. In terms of the topics we'll be covering, and in a way we've split the topic of future-proofing in half, in that we've got the immediate future concerns, such as hopefully it's fairly immediate, a return to the workplace, where that's appropriate, of course. Also more short-term considerations like managing holidays and sickness absence in 2021, but it's all relevant for future-proofing, and also supporting employee mental health, which is an ongoing issue. And then the crystal ball gazing, if you like, and looking at the future of the workplace and more of the bigger picture considerations around flexible working and agile working going forward. So it's very much a look at the short-term future-proofing and then the long-term future-proofing. So I'll pass over to Damien for this first little bit. So Damien.
Thanks, Owen. So I think it's helpful just to sort of reflect on where we are at the moment. And the reality is that a lot of businesses still have a large number of employees on furlough. As I'm sure you're all aware, the furlough scheme was extended to the 30th of September 2021, and there's currently about 4.7 million employees still on furlough. You can only furlough employees if coronavirus is affecting your operations. At the moment, the amount that can be reclaimed is still 80%, but that will be going down to 70% in July. So businesses will have to contribute 10%, and then 60% in August. So there'll be a contribution of 20% from the business on top of the pension contributions and employers' NI, which are always payable. From the 1st of May, it will be possible to furlough employees who've been on the books since the 2nd of March. I mean, I guess the reality is that if somebody has been employed recently, then there won't be a requirement to furlough them. But if circumstances do change, then that will be possible. Another point to bear in mind is that if you've got employees on furlough and the intention is probably to let them go as the scheme runs down, you cannot use furlough pay in respect of any notice periods. So that will have to be fully funded by you as a business. And the most important thing, though, in terms of future-proofing your own business, is to make sure you keep written records of any employees who are on furlough. You're going to have to maintain those records for 5 years, and HMRC may well do sort of random audits. You can't retrospectively furlough people now. So you have to have a written agreement in place at the time that they are furloughed, and that changed from the 13th of November last year. That was the last date that it was possible to retrospectively furlough anybody. As things stand, the message is still to encourage staff to work from home where possible, but we are seeing things opening up. We're seeing things opening up. You've probably noticed just in the last 2 weeks, the roads are much busier, the schools are open, and people are beginning to return to the workplace, particularly with the vaccination program that's being rolled out as well. That's been a big source of topic in its own right, whether businesses should have a vaccination policy in place or not. Our experience to date is that businesses are not making it mandatory. I mean, legally it is fraught with issues, I think, to try and insist on it, unless you are in a particular sector where you can demonstrate there's a genuine occupational requirement, such as care staff in a care home. But now is the time to think about the business in the coming months and years in terms of home working, returning to workplace, and redundancies. And it seems to me that it's swinging all the momentum. The pendulum is swinging all the time. When we had the first lockdown, everybody got sent home, and there was a huge novelty factor to it. Staff liked it. Businesses were thinking, actually, yes, we can operate remotely. There was a lot of surprise, but I think as time has gone on, there's been more time to reflect on things. And I think there is a case of the grass isn't always greener. So it's going to be a careful balancing act going forward, which is something we'll look at in more detail. So in terms of getting employees back into the workplace, if that is something that you're keen on doing, or if your staff are keen on returning to the workplace, one thing that has to be done is a risk assessment. I'm sure many of you will have done that already. It is mandatory, and that risk assessment has to look at all aspects of making the workplace COVID secure effectively. So that could mean putting in one-way systems in and out of buildings, making sure that there's at least 2 meters between staff where possible, and if not, that screens are put in place, hand sanitizers stations are distributed around the place, signs up about maintaining social distancing, those types of things, the things that we've all become used to dealing with on a day-to-day basis, whether we're going into a supermarket or whatever it may be. Again, when everybody is fully vaccinated, it may be that those measures can be reduced to some extent. But I think the reality is there's always going to be certain standards that we will be expected to maintain. And I mean, one of the positives is that out of all of this, staff are becoming less unwell because of other issues, such as flu, colds, etc. Just people maintaining better hygiene through hand washing and so on is having a knock-on effect. But it's no good just having a risk assessment and then doing nothing with it, as is the case with any policy that you may have regarding your staff. It needs to be communicated to staff. They need to fully understand where it is and what it means. So if you've got an intranet, then put it on there, make sure they're aware of it. If not, then circulate it by email, circulate it by hard copy, have hard copies available. Consult with staff about returning to the workplace. Some people are going to be keener than others. There's still a lot of nervous people. There was a case actually that's just came out last week relating to the coronavirus when it first broke last year, back in March, and it was before the initial lockdown, and it was in Scotland, and an employee basically came into the workplace and then said, "I'm going. I'm concerned about my. I have two vulnerable children. I'm concerned about them. So I'm not going to come into work." And he refused to come into work for about a month. He was subsequently dismissed. He had less than 2 years service, so he couldn't bring a straightforward unfair dismissal claim. So he brought a claim under health and safety regulation, and basically said that he left because he felt that he had a reasonable belief that he was in serious and imminent danger by being in the workplace when there was the COVID pandemic going on. And the tribunal held that his belief was not reasonable because the employer had taken all reasonable steps in line with government guidance at the time. So it's very important that you do that as part of your communication and consultation with staff. And then if you do have staff who are reluctant to return and you need them to return, then you may have to explore other options. But obviously, if it is possible for staff to work from home and they're reluctant to return, then that's something that you should bear in mind as well. So it is very important to be sympathetic to individual circumstances, and also to make sure that you don't do anything that could potentially be discriminatory by association. So if you have a member of staff who has to care for a disabled person or has childcare issues, it's very similar to just standard working practices where somebody would want to work flexibly because of that. Those are issues that you need to bear in mind. So that's important as well. Holidays. So the regulations were varied, and where employees were prevented from taking leave due to COVID-19, the working time regulations have been varied so that they're entitled to carry forward annual leave to the next 2 holiday years. So it is not an automatic right, and I think a lot of employees believe that it is. It's simply where they've been prevented from taking leave due to COVID-19. But I think employers need to be sympathetic as well. Some employees may have been able to take leave, but didn't because simply there was nothing to do with it. So that's something to bear in mind. But equally, you have to look at the needs of the business as well, because there's potentially a holiday time bomb in terms of if you've got a large number of employees and they've all got a lot of holiday to take and they all want to take it at the same time, it could create a bit of a nightmare in the next year or two. So I think it's very important that you get on top of this now if you haven't done so already. So make sure you know exactly the number of days holiday entitlement that each employee has got left, and communicate that to employees and encourage them to take annual leave. I mean, the reality is that people aren't going to be going off for 2 weeks in the sun, this summer. That's very unlikely. Hopefully, maybe towards the end of the year next year, foreign holidays will resume normally, but I certainly, it does appear at the moment that that's not going to be the case. But things are opening up in the UK, wonderful beaches down in West Wales and the likes of us. There's still plenty of great places for people to go to. So encourage them to take annual leave, try and get timetables in place with employees to know who's going to take what when. And you may need to think about actually forcing staff to take annual leave. And there are 2 ways of doing that. One, you may have a contractual right within their contracts of employment, but actually under the working time regulations, there is a statutory right whereby you have to serve notice that is at least twice the length of the holiday that you require the employee to take. So if you wanted them to take 5 days annual leave, you would have to give them 10 days notice. Now, I'm not saying that's something you necessarily want to do, but as a last resort, you could make that clear to employees that you will need to implement it if they're not willing to just start using up annual leave. Because ultimately, as I say, you don't want to find yourself in a position where you've just got weeks and weeks owing to employees, which could be a logistical nightmare, and B, become quite expensive in terms of lost productivity if you've got everybody trying to go off at the same time. And in terms of cancelling pre-arranged annual leave, I mean, in theory, you can. There's no legal requirement why you couldn't do that, but certainly it would most likely, or it could very well amount to a breach of the implied term of mutual trust and confidence. And if an employee has incurred costs as a result, they've paid a deposit, etc., and that has been lost, then you would almost certainly have to compensate them for any damages that they suffer. So, I mean, it's something best avoided if possible. It's something I would only suggest that you do as a last resort, but it is possible as long as you do it in the right way, and you have to, you explain very carefully why it is necessary, and you make sure that there is no loss.
Okay, so I'm going to deal with sickness absence very briefly before going on to a few other topics. So I've got one slide on managing sickness absence, and all the statistics at the moment demonstrate that if you take COVID-related sickness out of the equation, then in general, less people are being absent from work, and that includes people who are attending work, but also people who are home working. So I think it's important that employers keep on top of the issue by ensuring that staff are familiar with the sickness absence policy and with the reporting procedures, how you report that you're ill, what the pay provisions are when you're ill in terms of entitlement to full pay, half pay or SSP, and also in terms of evidencing sickness absence with your rules around self-certification or getting a doctor's note. So it's just important that employers do continue to engage with staff about sickness and communicate sickness policies, because as I say, all the statistics seem to suggest that apart from COVID, people just aren't reporting sick for work. Of course, the second bullet point is topical. Be aware of the current COVID regulations in terms of isolating. They tend to change a lot, don't they? The rules around COVID and self-isolating. So it's important to keep on top of that. And that final line about keeping communication open is a good rule of thumb in the pandemic generally, let alone on sickness absence and also holiday and all sorts of other topics. So supporting employee mental health. So before we go on to sort of some of the longer term implications of the new normal, if you want to call it that, we'll just look at this one little topic of supporting employee mental health, which has been topical but important right throughout the pandemic. It was important before that, of course, but it's come into the spotlight more since people have been separated and people have been working remotely from each other. It's important to note, of course, that in every employment relationship that exists in England and Wales or in the UK, there is an underlying implied duty of care on the employer to look out for the health and safety of their staff, and that includes the mental health and safety of their staff. So there are lots of reasons for supporting employees' mental health. One of them is that it's the right thing to do. Another is that from a practical perspective, you get more out of people, it's more productive, you're a caring, responsible employer, but also there's a legal obligation on you as an employer to look out for the mental health of your staff, and it falls under this duty of care to take reasonable care of health and safety of your staff. It's one thing doing that, it's another thing being able to prove that you've done it. So whilst there are all sorts of really good reasons why you should do this, in order to satisfy your legal obligation that you're doing this, I would always encourage you to have a paper trail where you are seem to be very mindful of this issue, where you check in with people, where you send out communication to staff, where you signpost them to places they can go, you signpost them to policies you've got, or helplines, or external resources, internal resources, and you also you make a point of checking in with people, and you make a point of emphasizing to line managers that they should check in with people and that they should keep a paper trail, as long as there's no breach of confidentiality, of course, that you keep a paper trail of having checked in with people. So the next bullet points are all following on from that in many ways, where as an employer, certain things you can do. I mean, you can encourage a positive home work-life balance, where you encourage lunch breaks and finishing the day at a reasonable time, and carrying out regular one-to-one meetings and checking in with people and signposting and mental health first aiders. It all really comes under this umbrella of, as an employer, satisfying your duty of care towards employees, but also being able to demonstrate that you are satisfying your duty of care. So we are moving on to sort of some of the longer term implications now, and the future of the workplace, which is quite a big topic, but we're going to try and cover some of the issues involved right now. We're going to deal with these topics in the main. So flexible working, which is different, and we'll explain why, to agile working, and we'll also look at the role of technology and the pitfalls as well as the benefits of technology in the employment relationship. So I'll pass back to Damien for the next little bit on this.
Thanks, so flexible working is probably something that you're all familiar with. It's been around for some time, and essentially it's just establishing a work pattern that's been designed for a specific employee and can involve changing an employee's days of work, hours of work, allowing them to work from home certain days of the week. But it is a regular pattern. Agile working is far newer and has become quite a sort of buzzword during the pandemic, as a result of the pandemic. And basically, it just is a range of different working arrangements. There is no fixed pattern as such. So, and employees are given more autonomy in a flexible working, an agile working arrangement. So they will have options to choose when they start work, when they finish work, whether they come into the office, whether they go and work from a cafe, whether they work from home, whether they choose not to work one particular day at all and make it up on a different day. So that's what agile working is. It's not defined in the same way, and it's not fixed in the same way as flexible working. So what we'll do is just look at each of them in turn. So I'll look at flexible working, and then Owen will look at agile working. So as I say, flexible working is the more traditional arrangement that many of you will be familiar with and will have been in place for some time. One of the considerations to think about is the contractual provisions. So is there anything in an existing contract of employment that may allow for flexible working? If flexible working is going to be agreed, is it going to amount to a permanent contractual change? Will you need to issue new contracts of employment as a consequence, or could a side letter suffice? That's something to give consideration to. Duty of care, Owen touched on that earlier. You know, mental health is a massive issue at the moment, the welfare of your staff. And as I said, on the face of it, an option could look particularly attractive initially, and then it's only with the passing of time that it could become apparent to both the employer and the employee that actually it's not as attractive as initially perceived. And home working is a classic example. you can have situations we've certainly had with younger staff who may not be fortunate enough to live in their own home, so they may live in shared accommodation, sharing a house with other housemates. It can be very difficult for them to have somewhere to work quietly, somewhere to work effectively. They may be stuck on a kitchen table. I heard of one person who was using an ironing board as a desk. So if you're going to have somebody working from home, then permanently, then there is an obligation to look at their workstation, making sure that they are set up properly and not exposed to any health and safety risks. And also in terms of mental well-being, I've got a client who has an employee who basically has not set foot into the premises since March last year, and that employee is almost becoming institutionalized now. Is not just becoming more reclusive from colleagues and the work environment, but basically from society as a whole. The colleague, the employee lives on his own, and the employer is now needing to intervene and to actually take steps to get him back in. So that's a consideration. You need to be able to keep on top of these things if you're going to have flexible working. Confidentiality and data security, a massive issue. If you have people taking electronic devices, mobile devices, laptops away from the workplace, are they going to be, if they're going to be working in cafes, are they going to be going onto public Wi-Fi? Is information encrypted? Are laptops encrypted? Will they be using USB sticks and the like? Will they be saving things to the cloud? Big GDPR implications if you get it wrong. Potential issues with clients and customers, regulators if you have regulatory bodies. Certainly us as lawyers, we're regulated by the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, and confidentiality is a massive issue for us, massive. And if we get that wrong, we're potentially exposed to some very, very serious sanctions. The actual role that somebody is in, is it going to be possible for them to carry out that role effectively, working flexibly? Will they need to be in the workplace? Some roles simply have to be on site. That's the reality of it. And then that goes on to the wider impact on the business and just morale, whether you could go too far one way or the other. You could say, let's be fully flexible and agile, and actually everyone just becomes estranged from each other, and that could have an impact on the business. Or you could basically say, no, we're not having any of it. We're a traditional business, we work in traditional ways, and then you'll find that you won't recruit talent that you'll need for your business going forward. Morale could be low. So they're all sort of practical considerations to bear in mind. In terms of legal considerations when it comes to flexible working, there are a couple of things to consider. So there is a statutory right to request flexible working under the flexible working regulations. That is whereby an employee can make one request every 12 months. They will need to explain why they want to work flexibly, how it'll impact on the business, and what the arrangement is that they are proposing. And then there are 8 statutory reasons why an employer can turn down that request. But then also you have to think about other legislation, particularly indirect discrimination. For example, with sex discrimination, it is established that more women than men have childcare responsibilities. So more women than men will have a requirement to work flexibly, for example, during only during school hours. and then that they need to be at home for children or childcare. Obviously, there are men, and I mean, I think that's certainly one of the things that has come out of lockdown, is that a lot more men have had an opportunity to enjoy time with their families that they may not have done, and have realised the benefits of doing that, and are now looking to actually share childcare responsibilities in a much broader way. So there'll be a potentially direct discrimination by treating a male less favourably, when a business may have said, well, as a mother we would let you do it, but as a father we're not. So that's a consideration. And then disability discrimination as well. Reasonable adjustments may be necessary, which could include flexible working arrangements to accommodate a person's disability. They may need to have some time working at home, for example, just to have a more peaceful environment if they're working on a particular project. If stress and anxiety in the workplace doesn't allow them to think straight, then working at home may be an adjustment that you could make to accommodate their particular condition at any time. So different legal considerations as well to take on board. And in terms of handling flexible working requests, it's good practice to have a flexible working policy, setting out examples of flexible working arrangements, how requests could be made, particularly if they're going to be made under the statutory provisions, because that is a very defined process in terms of, as I say, you can only make one request every 12 months. There are the 8 reasons for turning it down, and so on. And again, like any other policy, if you do have a particular policy, make sure that it is widely available. Everybody, when they start the business, is made aware of it as part of their induction training, and then they are regularly informed and updated during the course of their employment as well. Assess the individual circumstances of each request, and clearly they are going to have to be made on an individual basis, and each person's particular circumstances is going to have to be assessed on the merits, and consider offering a trial period before committing to a flexible working arrangement. And that's quite important, I think, under the statutory provisions, because a flexible request that is accepted under the statutory provisions will become a permanent contractual change. So, for example, it's very common when you have a parent, particularly a mother, returning from parental leave or maternity leave, that they may initially come back part-time, but the intention is to build up those hours. But if it is done as I'm just going to come back 2 days a week, and that is done as a flexible working request, that becomes a permanent contractual change, and that may not work for you as a business, and in the medium to long term work for the employee as well. So trial periods or having review periods in place is always something you should consider as well.
Thanks. So moving on to agile working now, which Damien has mentioned what agile working is and how it is distinguished from flexible working. I mean, one of the most common questions I've been getting over the past couple of weeks, if not months, actually, along with what are we doing about this vaccine? The next most common question I've been getting from clients is the pandemic has shown us that we can work in an agile way. People have been productive, people have been flexible, and it's all worked. The world hasn't come to an end. Our organization hasn't come to an end. It's all fine. It's worked. But how do we reflect that in our contracts? In other words, it's fine paying lip service to agile working. It's fine saying to our staff, we're an agile employer, and we're great, we're really reasonable, we'll let you do your hours whenever you want. But actually, what are we going to do about the physical contract that's in place? And it's it's a really, really good question that lots of employers are grappling with. And at the core of the answer to that question, I won't sit on the fence. I will give you an answer to that question. I will give you an answer as to how I've advised those clients, but I've given you that teaser now, and now I'm going to explain to you why I came to that answer. But at the heart of this issue is this shift, I guess, from thinking about an employment contract in the kind of the very traditional measure of how you assess somebody's time. So I guess the phrase that's often used is input-based employment contracts, where you've got set hours of work, and those are the hours that you input into the employment. Traditionally 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, of course, with variations on that. Those are your hours, those are your contracted hours, and those are the hours that you're obliged to complete. There is a shift, there is a school of thought that employment contracts in lots of industries, and it won't be possible in every industry, but in some sectors and industries, employment contracts can move away from that input-based justification to an output-based model of an employment contract, where rather than saying, well, these are the hours you've got to put in, you say, well, this is what we need out of it from you. This is what we need from you. The difficulty with that is that it's only in certain sectors and certain industries where you can measure performance in a way that you can say, this is the specific target we need from you. This is what we want from you. And it's very measurable and it's very clear. Most employers are actually quite traditional in the way that, quite simply, they pay for people's time. They pay for their employees' time. And therefore, the very long way of answering that question that I posed at the start as to being an agile worker-friendly employer, but how you reflect that in a contract, is my advice to most of my clients has been that I still think you need a reference to hours of work. Because the difficulty is, if you haven't got it, of course, what happens if somebody pushes the boundaries and doesn't perform their work? How can you then keep them to task? And also, there is a potential national living wage issue and a potential HMRC issue here. If you haven't got set hours, or you haven't got any reference to hours of work in an employment contract, how are you keeping track of the fact that somebody isn't working, sort of Elon Musk style 100 hours a week, and therefore falling below the threshold of the national living wage for their hours? So my advice to clients has been, I still see a future for hours of work in an employment contract. That doesn't necessarily have to be the rigid 9 till 5. Lots of my clients have got core hours of work where they say, our core hours are between X and X, but we still expect you to do your overall hours in a week outside of those hours. Other employer clients of mine have got set hourly targets for staff. So they'll say, in a week you will undertake 37.5 or 35 hours of work, and then it's up to them to perform those hours within the week time frame. I mean, the one issue, of course, is that it's fine doing that, but I think it's really, really important that there is a record kept. So that's the other side of this, is that if you are going to go a step further from what you do now in terms of your rigid 9 till 5 clause in an employment contract and reflect agile working in that clause, then I think you need a way of people time recording or keeping timesheets, and you need some kind of mechanism for doing something about the fact that somebody perhaps might not be hitting their hours. So that's the challenge, I think, going forward in employment law for agile working. Is I think we've all recognized that we can work in a more agile way, but the challenge is going to be how we reflect that in contractual documents, and what we do when things go wrong, what we do when somebody defaults on their side of the bargain. Because at the moment, if somebody is an hour late to work and their set start time is 9 a.m. or they disappear early without permission before 5 p.m., then traditionally, it's always been the case that you can say you're in breach of your contract because you're in breach of your hours. It's going to be a challenge. It's not insurmountable, but it's going to be a challenge going forward to work those things out and to work out how we reflect this agile relationship in a contract, but also how we keep tabs of people's time and what we do if they don't perform their hours or their work as required. I mean, there are some industries where I accept it's quite unusual, and you won't necessarily even have to refer to time. You'll say there are certain sales targets, for example, in the sales industry, there are certain sales targets that you have to achieve on a weekly basis. So those are things to think about. I mean, the last bullet point there is if you are going to implement changes on agile working, then you need to think about consulting with staff on that, and you also need to think about whether you do it consistently across the board. I mean, I think it's rife with issues of discrimination and people being treated less favorably if you handpick people for agile working, or if you even handpick certain areas of an organization for agile working without a clear rationale as to why the rest can't work in an agile way. So I think it's important, it's a moving beast, I think, agile working, and lots of these issues I flag are things that there are no clear-cut answers to at the moment, and I think they will come in time. Kind of hand in hand with this, of course, is the role of technology. I mean, we're on technology now, we're on Zoom now, so that goes to show how well it's worked and how well people have adapted. There is an element of Zoom fatigue, I think. I think there are lots of conversations that people would rather have in the flesh, but lots of conversations have worked quite well over Zoom. I mean, we've advised on, I can't tell you how many redundancy processes and consultations and investigation meetings, disciplinary meetings, grievance meetings that have all gone online, and actually they've worked remarkably well, and people have felt more comfortable in them. It's taken an element of the awkwardness out of the equation. They've been easily recorded through Zoom. For example, this is being recorded, and that has meant that there's been less disputes around the accuracy of notes taken. So there are all sorts of ways in which technology has helped us through this pandemic, and lots of that is to stay. I mean, I thought I'd flag the issue of monitoring employees through IT software. I mean, there's been a lot of this in the press recently. I'm not sure whether some of you will have seen this, and I'm not advising that this is the route to go down at all, by the way, but there is an industry sprung up around IT monitoring of employees working remotely and working from home. So there's a software called Sneak, which is, it almost does what it says on the tin, which works through the webcam in an employee's PC, and an employer can set a time interval at which that webcam takes a photo of the employee sat behind their desk. I mean, from my perspective, that's completely ridiculous, because an employee's performance of their duties and correct performance of their duties is not linked to them being chained to a chair. But it's just to show that there's an industry springing up to respond to this. I don't think that's the way to go, because personally, I think it works much better for you as employers from a practical perspective if you've got that element of trust. And I think people are more productive if you've got that element of trust with people. And also there's an argument to say that legally, well, you can't monitor people without their permission anyway, but there's also an argument as to whether you are intervening with the sort of the duty of trust and confidence that exists between employer and employee by going to that length to monitor them. I mean, there are slightly less direct methods of IT software monitoring. For example, there's one which is mind-bogglingly clever, which is able somehow through artificial intelligence to monitor the movements on your mouse and your keyboard to show whether those movements seem to reflect that you're doing your work, as opposed to, apparently there's a different style of mouse movement for internet browsing. So there are all sorts of software springing up. There's another product, for example, that gives people a daily score for their productivity based on screen activity and mouse movement. So employees will get a score out of 100 for their performance for the day. I personally, I don't like it, because I think it reduces individuals down to a number, and that's their worth to the organization. So I'm raising these things, but I'm telling you that I think the route of trust and honesty is a better policy, both from a practical perspective, but also from a legal perspective. And that's, for now, during the remaining throes of this pandemic, but also going forward, you know, if we're looking sort of 5 or 10 years down the line. So that's all from us. I mean, we're around the 45-minute mark. If you've got any questions, please feel free to raise your voices now, or to pop them in the chat facility. We will probably, Damien and I will probably stick around for a couple of brief moments, just in case anybody wants to stick on the line and have a chat with us. But otherwise, I think from us, thank you very much for listening. And as I say, the slides and the recording will follow. I think we've got something in the chat. Yeah, that's just a thank you. So as I say, any questions, we're both available for a couple of moments, and also you know, you can contact us on our emails or our phone numbers from the website as well. But from our perspective, thank you very much for listening.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions. Yeah, so we've got 2 questions there, so maybe we'll split them in half. I mean, the first one, if I take that one, because it kind of leads on from the agile working point. So is there any sort of agile working policy or advised documents we could maybe have to consider? I mean, yes, there are. I mean, it's been the case that most employers will have a flexible working policy that's been in place for a number of years, and but that flexible working policy is more to do with the right to request, the statutory right to request flexible working, and the prescribed grounds for refusing that flexible working request. So that's what your flexible working policy will look like. In terms of an agile working policy, it is something that lots of employers are now looking at developing, and I mean, lots of employers will have remote working policies. I mean, we've worked on lots of those during the pandemic for clients. Remote working policies will cover off things such as insurance, because that's a bit of a minefield. Who maintains insurance if you're performing your work duties remotely from another setting, whether that be from home or a laptop anywhere in the world, potentially. Confidentiality, data protection, also the issue of monitoring. So lots of those, and breaks, the fact that an employer will want something in the policy to say that, look, it's over to you really to ensure that you take breaks so that you are looking after yourself here. So yes, is the answer. I mean, there are lots of policies that I could advise you put in place, but an agile working policy or a remote working policy or a home worker policy goes that bit further than your traditional flexible working policy. Damien, do you want to take?
Yeah, I'm just looking at this one from Eileen.
Yeah.
Eileen, I'm interested to know what makes someone office based and someone home based for our employers' responsibilities to them. I mean, I think the reality is, classic law, it depends. I think the way things going forward are looking is it's going to become less frequent to have someone who's purely office based or someone who's purely home based, and the reality is there's going to be more of a blend, and that's the sort of whole concept of agile working. And it seems to be the feedback that employers are now getting from their employees is that they want to have this blend of having some working on site, whether it be in a premise, in an office or other premises, and then some agile working from home and wherever it may be. But essentially the duties, the responsibilities are the same. There's the same duty of care to look after someone's health and safety, whether that's their mental health, whether that's their physical health in terms of workstations. If somebody is going to be working from a desk in an office and also working from a desk at home, those desks are going to have to comply to the same standards, the setup, monitors, chairs, etc. There is an obligation to carry out a workstation review on both of them. And as Owen pointed out, there are practical considerations such as insurance. Virtually every home and contents insurance that we all have as individuals will ask you whether you carry on a business from your home. And generally it is allowed purely for administrative purposes. But if you are carrying on business on behalf of an employer from home, then that's something that will have to be declared, because otherwise the particular employee could find that their insurance is null and void. So there's a responsibility on the employer there to make sure that is done and that the employees are aware of that position.
Yeah, so I guess the label of a home worker or a remote worker or a hybrid worker is kind of irrelevant from your responsibilities as an employer. Your responsibilities are your responsibilities, whether they be working right in front of you, opposite you on the same pod, or whether they be in another country. Your obligations as an employer, you still got that duty of care. So I don't think that the label is actually that important. There are lots of questions, lots of people flagging templates. I mean, it's a difficult one from my experience with agile working or home working policies. It's very difficult to have a standard policy that does the job for you. It's not like a flexible working policy or a maternity policy or an equal opportunities policy, which a lot of them look the same. From my experience, an agile working policy has to be very, very bespoke to your organization. I think it needs an awful lot of thought by you and input from you to your personal circumstances or your organizational circumstances. Unfortunately, I don't think it's something that you could just take a template and say that's going to apply to us. It really needs some bespoke thought, is my view, Damien. I'm not sure whether you share that.
I agree. I mean, and it's going to depend very much on the nature of the business and how roles can be performed, and what sort of blend that you're looking to achieve as well in terms of having the agile working element and the element then working from the premises. But I do think it is important to have one, and I think it is. As I said, when this all started, the initial response was working from home is great and that's the future and we're all going to work from home. There's been more time to reflect on that. And I think people have realized actually we're going to have an element of home working, agile working, but we're still going to need premises. Those premises may be smaller. So a lot of businesses are looking to reduce their premises and reduce their sort of overheads. But I think if, as organisations, you're not willing to embrace this sort of way of working going forward, the reality is that recruitment will become an issue, not just recruitment, but retention as well. Because if your competitor is offering the ability to work in a different way that is more appealing, then I think a lot of new talent and existing talent may be swayed by that. It's not to say that everyone's going to want to do that, and there will be some people who just say, yeah, I just want to come in every day, and that should be open to them as well.
There's one question from Jesse where you say, within agile working, can we request that there is a minimal office attendance per week, month? For example, attend the office once every couple of weeks. Would this still be classed as agile working? I mean, it doesn't really matter whether it's classed as agile working or not. I mean, it's very doable. I can't see a problem at all with that. And in many ways, it is kind of agile working because you're giving them the freedom to do whatever they want on the days that they're not requested in. So sorry, Damien, you come in.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, I mean, I think that is agile working, and I think a requirement like that would fit very much with agile working. I mean, agile working does not mean that every hour is agile. Agile work, it's about having that blend, and I think it's actually it's not just good. I think it's essential that employers still will require some minimal sort of attendance, because it's necessary just from an engagement point of view. You know, and not all roles. I mean, take us for example as solicitors. Every year we have a number of trainee solicitors who we train and develop as solicitors. It's very difficult to do that remotely because you learn so much as a trainee just through osmosis by watching your colleagues and listening to your colleagues, and it's just I do worry that there could be certainly a generation in different particularly sort of professional services that if they don't benefit from that, they just won't develop in the same way. So it is important to categorize where agile working will be possible, and in certain roles it just simply isn't going to work.
So I think that's it for now in terms of questions, unless anybody else has got anything. But as I say, you know, more than happy to be contacted by email or phone whenever. So on that note, I think we'll say, well, yeah, diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much for attending, and yeah, have a nice day.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of the day. Diolch yn fawr.